What is the history of our church? Veritas Church was planted in 2008, but we actually have a much longer history than that when you think about where we are along the timeline of church history, which began after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. So let me walk you through it quickly, and I'll take you all the way back. The history of the church from the death of the apostles, really for the next 1,500 years, is a story of doctrinal struggle and persecution. Very early on in church history, we can see that certain truths were coming under attack, and so Christians were forced early on to come together, to open up the Bible, to agree on what the Scriptures teach, and then to write those things down. And this is where we get a lot of the creeds and confessions that we still have today. We're not surprised that the church dealt with that. Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and told him that a day was coming when people were not going to put up with sound teaching. So early church history, a lot of doctrinal struggle, but also persecution. This is where Christians were being punished, where they were being abused and even killed because of their belief in Jesus Christ. It began officially in Acts chapter 7 with the stoning of Stephen and only grew and intensified from there. That changed a bit when Constantine came on the scene. So to talk about him briefly, he was a Roman emperor in the early 300s. And the year 312, at the age of 40, Constantine had some kind of a religious experience, and the very next year in 313, in the Edict of Milan, Constantine, the Roman emperor, legalized Christianity, which was great. It brought an end to organized persecution. But a negative, you could say, is that for the first time in that region, people had other reasons to claim Christ other than legitimate belief in him. Before that, to claim Christ was possibly a death sentence. Once Christianity was legalized, there began to become all kinds of other reasons that came into play of why someone might call themselves a Christian. And what began to happen at that starting point is that, unfortunately and often, the church began to look a lot more like the world around it. So this is all taking place in the West. And over the centuries to follow, things really went from bad to worse. The church started to look more like the civil government. And so the authority of the church was distorted. The authority of the popes became more significant than biblically warranted. There was unbiblical devotion to Mary and to saints that had died. There was the claiming to forgive original sin through baptism, to forgive ongoing sin through the practice of formal confession and penance. The church eventually claims to dispense God's grace as she sees fit. Other heresies creep in, like doing one's best as a prerequisite to receiving the grace of God, indulgences to earn merit, purgatory for further purging of sins. So the church goes from bad to worse. Well, that changes now in the 16th century, in the year 1517. In that year, Pope Leo X wanted to build a new church, and to raise money, he hired Johann Tetzel, who was a marketing genius. He had a saying, and he would say, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, another soul from purgatory springs," which is essentially selling salvation, which was going well until it was heard by a pastor in Germany who had been reading his Bible and growing increasingly uncomfortable with the practices of the church. And his name was Martin Luther. And Martin Luther had come to understand that he was saved by faith alone, in Christ alone, that it had nothing to do with any good that he had done, that it was impossible for him to merit God's salvation. And so in 1517, on October 31st, he'd finally had enough. He had a list of 95 complaints against the Roman Catholic Church, known as his 95 Theses, and he nailed it to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. This did not go well for Martin Luther. In fact, in 1521, at the Diet of Worms, he was formally condemned by the church, and he was left to live a life that was largely in secret and on the run. But he survives the ordeal, and while that was happening, God was raising up other people with similar convictions, like Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich and John Calvin in Geneva, Martin Bucer in France, and Thomas Cranmer in England. And these men and others were part of what has become known as the Reformation. They were Protestants. They were Protestants. They were protesting what they saw as Rome's abuses. And so at Veritas Church now, we find our heritage in the West, of course, and now in the Reformation in Protestants. Now, closing that even closer, among Protestants at that time, there are three major groups, and I won't go into all the differences, but there were Lutherans, and there were Anabaptists, and there were Reformed churches. We would trace our lineage back to the Reformed churches. And among the Reformed churches, there were Presbyterians, there were Congregationalists, and there was the Church of England. And what they had in common is that they emphasized God's sovereignty in salvation, and they had a Protestant view of baptism and the Lord's Supper. Next, what happened is that early in the 17th century, some in the Church of England began to question paedobaptism, which was the baptism of infants. And these men and women were becoming Baptists. And it is out of that strand of Reformed churches that we get the Baptists. And again, this is where we would trace our heritage. So on both sides of the Atlantic then, Baptists were being persecuted by the established church. And so Roger Williams asks to charter a new colony, which would be Rhode Island. And in 1639, he and 11 others founded the very first Baptist church in America. And Baptist churches in the 17th and early 18th century in this country, they were very similar, and they shared a Reformed confessional understanding of the faith. They were saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, to the glory of God alone. These were Reformed Baptist churches. Now that did change in this country. Over time, those churches become much more liberal in their theology. Baptist churches spread like wildfire across the frontier, probably because that they were largely informal and they were loosely organized, which made it easy to plant these Baptist churches. And unfortunately, over time, many of those Baptist churches became less tight and grounded in their theology, to the point that today there are probably less Reformed Baptist churches than there are non-Reformed Baptist churches. But this is where we come from. So to summarize that, Veritas Church, which was planted by myself and about 20 others in our living room in 2008 in Roseville, California, while our small local church was new on the map, we've got a rich heritage. We are a Western, Protestant, Reformed Baptist church.